that we don't see the United States present yet is that until we end up being attacked, all we're going to do is send some advisors to try and keep South Vietnam from going communist. Well, that attack happens in 1964, in August, when there's an attack on some naval vessels in a place called the Gulf of Tonkin, which is just off of the coast of North Vietnam. And that resolution that's passed, that Congress says is going to be that President Johnson can use any means necessary to win the war in Vietnam. And that means that the war is going to become incredibly destructive. On one side, in South Vietnam, you'll have the Viet Cong guerrilla army using absolutely vicious numbers of booby traps. I'll put some of them up here on the screen. Booby traps like you see right here, where you step on, this would be covered right here with leaves and grass, and then when you step on it, the leaves and grass fall through, and your body hits this, and you slide into this, and these rollers kind of roll as you slide down, and they pierce your body way up as you go up. As your body falls in, it gets pierced in multiple places. This one here has stakes sharpened at the bottom, oftentimes smeared with fecal matter from animals or humans to cause infection when you would step on it and fall through, and then you'd be pierced by these stakes. Or here, these grenades, which are tied and hidden amongst the foliage, so just as you're walking along at head height, and you bump into the wrong branch, and the pin falls out of the grenade, and everyone ends up near you getting injured or worse. In fact, the main goal of a Vietnamese booby trap is not to kill, it's to injure, because by injuring one person, you take at least two out of the fight, the one who's injured and the one who's caring for the person who's injured. So oftentimes they would just terribly use these silent booby traps, waiting to get our troops in the day or in the night. In return, we use terrible weapons as well. We'll look at Agent Orange tomorrow in class to kill the entire jungle, but one of the ones that we use is something called napalm, which I know we talked about when we did World War II, that jellied gasoline that we use to burn out the jungle, to burn out the Viet Cong when we can't see them in the incredibly dense forest, in the incredibly dense jungle. We drop napalm on it and we burn them out. It forces them to retreat. Napalm is still used. So, for example, here is some jellied napalm, which has actually been dropped in this case in Syria today, in the Syrian civil war. So napalm is still used in the Syrian civil war. In fact, that's your word, I think, for this lesson: Syria. So, we certainly fight the war in terrible ways. We certainly will do what we can to fight back as they fight us in very difficult ways. We certainly fight the war in difficult ways as well. But we face a number of problems in this war, which is that most South Vietnamese people want the Viet Cong to win. Most South Vietnamese people want the Viet Cong to win, and they want to join North Vietnam. They want to be communist. The other is that the North Vietnamese army helps the Viet Cong, and they do so by way of a series of supply chains and networks called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And I have a map of it here for you, and it's in two different colors, in black and in yellow. So what you'll see in black are big truck paths, big truck trails, and then in yellow are footpaths. And so what you'll see is huge amounts of supplies will leave North Vietnam on these trucks, and they will travel on these truck paths, which are in black, throughout Laos and Cambodia, heading towards South Vietnam. You might even see supplies carried on elephant back on these kind of bigger, large roads. And then they're going to get to these footpaths. Once they hit these large roads, once they can't go any further, you'll see them on these small paths where bicycles are used, where people walk on foot, and they bring these supplies into South Vietnam in order for the Viet Cong to have the materials they need to fight the United States. And President Johnson won't even allow a full-scale attack on the Ho Chi Minh Trail because he's afraid that other countries will get involved in the war. I mean, look, this is a war that America's fighting in South Vietnam against rebels. And we're not fighting North Vietnam. We're fighting in South Vietnam against rebels. That's the Vietnam War, at least in the beginning. The Vietnam War is a war against rebels in South Vietnam. So why would we go bombing Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, North, if they're not officially in the war? We don't want to broaden the war. It has limited goals, a limited objective. because it's a limited war. The problem, of course, here is that North Vietnam is getting the weapons and materials it needs to send to the South from the Soviet Union, which is way up here, and from China, which is right here. So the weapons and the supplies are coming from the Soviet Union and China. They're heading to North Vietnam. Then they're getting on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They're heading to the Viet Cong in the South, where they're used to kill American service personnel. So President Johnson is going to say, look, I know the Viet Cong are getting their supplies from North Vietnam. I know North Vietnam's getting its supplies from China and the Soviet Union. But if we invade North Vietnam to shut down the supply chain, that could bring China or even the Soviet Union into the war. We can't do that. Essentially, President Johnson's fighting this war with both legs and one arm tied behind his back. He can't fight North Vietnam because he's worried about China. Can't fight China because he's worried about the Soviet Union. Can't fight in Laos or Cambodia because he's worried about those nations joining the war, maybe even becoming communist in general. It's a real mess. Johnson's in a really difficult place, and those limits make it hard to win. As a result, and here's what's interesting, this isn't a war about capturing territory. Remember, we already have the territory. It's South Vietnam. This is a war about body counts. It's how many Viet Cong can you kill? If we kill enough of them, there won't be any more. If we kill them fast enough, high enough numbers, there won't be any more. That's the goal. That's going to make it incredibly difficult to fight and win this war in the long term. And we'll talk more about that in the coming lessons.